Once you've finished practice sewing your e-textile circuit with colored thread, and after you've shown me or your teacher that you've done it correctly and have received credit for doing so, then it's time to replace your stitches, your threads, with conductive thread. To do that, you're going to need a seam ripper. And the way a seam ripper works is it's got a really sharp edge right here, and you just put this pointy part underneath one of the stitches and push forward. Now, I want you to notice that my hand is not up here. I don't have my hand in front of the seam ripper. I have it behind the seam ripper. And that's to make sure that I don't, when I'm pushing, I have to push a little bit hard with this one because it's a little bit dull. When I'm pushing, I don't accidentally stab myself. Once you've ripped one of those stitches, you can actually just kind of pull on them sometimes, and sometimes they'll come undone. There's another knot under here, so I'm going to have to rip another stitch. And again, my hand is behind the seam ripper as I push. Now, you also want to make sure that your fabric isn't folded forward. If I were to push really hard right here and my seam ripper jabbed into here, I might cut my felt. So I'm going to line it up so that that fabric's out of the way. And when I push really hard, I don't stab my own project. Once you've ripped out your first thread, I recommend replacing it with a piece of conductive thread right away. And that's because these other threads are actually holding your electronics in place, which will make it a lot easier to sew in your conductive thread. Here I have two different pieces of cardboard that are storing different lengths of conductive thread that have already been prepared for me. And by prepared, I mean I super glue the ends so they won't fray, which will make it a lot easier to thread them through a needle. At any rate, this thread right here is one of the longer ones, so I'm going to go ahead and use the 18-inch length thread here. So I'm going to just pull that off of the cardboard tab. And then I'll use the 12-inch for these shorter lengths, the green and the blue for the signal wires. And then I'll use an 18-inch length again for this longer power line. Sometimes if one end doesn't thread well, you can go to the other end. It might work a little bit better. So now to sew this ground line in again, I'm going to do the exact same thing I did the first time with the black thread. The only real difference with conductive thread is that when you tie your knots, they can spring open, sort of. And so you want to tie them just a little bit tighter than you tie knots when you're using regular thread. So I'm going to just pull a little bit extra tight right there. Once you have replaced all of the thread for all of your connections here with conductive thread, it's time to test those connections and make sure they work. So I'm going to flip it over here. We're going to take a look at the back and we're going to look for a few things. First of all, I see right here that this connection right here, that's our first signal wire thread. There's a short right here. It's connected to the power line. So I'm going to pull this thread out from underneath that stitch that I accidentally pinned down when I was sewing my power line. And then I'm going to use some masking tape to tape it in line with the rest of itself here. So this is all signal wire thread here. I'm going to tape it right down so that it doesn't cross over that power line, because the thread sort of wants to bend that way. Up here, I've got a longer thread that's crossing the power line too, and I don't want that to cause a problem, so I'm going to cut it about 1 inch here. And notice I'm not using my fabric scissors. I'm using some other scissors that aren't quite as good, but I don't want to dull my fabric scissors on conductive thread. And then I'm going to bend this line down and tape it down. And then this one here, I'm just going to tape that up and out of the way. This is the end of my power line. And here I've got the second signal wire, this or thread. This one here connects these two spots. And it wants to sort of lay over here on the ground wire. So I'm going to cut that one down to 1 inch as well. You want to leave a significant tail on these so that it's easy to glue them. So I'm folding it back over onto itself. So this second signal wire is only laying on top of other second signal wires or second signal threads. I did not connect it to the first signal thread, which is over here. And then this thread here is the end of the ground thread. It's hanging off on the side. I don't think we need to tape it down. I don't see anything else crossing here, so I'm going to flip my teddy bear back over and make sure that nothing's crossing. And then I am going to take the code that I developed in my Control Multiple RGB LEDs assignment, load it onto my ATtiny 85, and then pull that out of my programmer and put it into my control board here. And then I'm going to turn this on and hope everything works. So I programmed it to make the first LED red and the second one green. I didn't worry about making these change colors because I already tested for that when I first created or when I first made my smart RGB LEDs. Now that we know everything is working, I'm going to go ahead and take the masking tape off of the back of my stuffed animal here and the front of my stuffed animal, I guess. And I'm going to glue those the knots that start and end all of my threads. Right here I have some fabric glue, and I'm just going to create a little blob around each tail of thread here. Now I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. I typically give it about a day to completely cure. And I'm going to make sure that I put the lid on my fabric glue. Once the glue on the knots has dried, it's time to cut your tails short. So I'm going to cut them to about 1/4 inch in length. I don't need to cut them any shorter than that because there's no way that this tail here is long enough to reach over to another piece of thread. So I'll do that for all of them. Sometimes you might see that they're sort of glued down a little bit, and you can pull up just a little bit and then cut. Notice I'm not using my fabric scissors. I'm using a different pair of scissors so that I don't dull my fabric scissors on conductive thread. Now if we look at the entire circuit here, there's no way that any one of these tails can reach over to a different length here, different thread and short circuit. Even right here where I have 2 knots close by, the tails aren't long enough to reach each other. None of these tails are long enough to reach each other. So once you've glued and cut the tails of your conductive thread, the next step is to look for places on your circuit where you have a circuit board that can kind of flap around here. So you can see I got this part that can move up and down. And then over here for this eyeball, there's one free pad right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew those down, and I'm going to sew them down using upholstery thread that is the same color as the felt. Doesn't have to be, but I think that looks nice. If you have a different color scheme in mind, that is completely fine. And since we're not going to be gluing these knots, we're just going to sew right where we want to hold things down. We don't need to start a distance away from that pad. So I'm going to sew around that 3 times. So I'm going to pull until there's a tail about like that, and then I'm making 3 wraps for 2 different reasons. One, I kind of want it to look similar to the other conductive thread, and 2, I just want it to be really strong. So you can see now I've got 3 wraps here, and if I flip to the back side, I can go ahead and pull it really tight, and then I'm just going to tie a square knot. There we go. And I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to worry about gluing it. I don't need to glue it. The only thing it might do is insulate that pad in the future, which might cause a problem if I decide I want to continue a circuit off of that pad. So I'm just going to leave a relatively long tail. Doesn't really matter because this isn't conductive thread, so there's no way it's going to cause a problem by shorting out if it touches these other threads. And now I'm going to sew down just 2 of these pads. There's 4 open ones, but I don't need to sew all 4 of them. I only need to sew, let's see here, I think this one here and that one there, and that should be enough to keep it from flopping around. All right, I finished sewing this pad, and this pad down so that my circuit boards are securely fastened to the felt. They're not going to flip around or wobble around, which will prevent these connections from being stressed and then just make it look better too. And it's worth noting that I didn't use conductive thread and I didn't glue it down. The not gluing it down part's a big deal because it might be the case that later on I decide to add some sort of circuitry to my teddy bear, and I actually end up cutting these off and replacing them with conductive thread. And the way I have it now, it'll be relatively easy to cut them off. It won't be a big deal.